I first became involved with the issue of cults out of a personal experience in 1983. My grandmother lived in a Jewish nursing home. She was in her 80s, and I would go visit her. And one time when I went to visit her to take her to lunch, she was very upset. And I asked her what she was upset about, and she told me that someone had been screaming at her in the nursing home, and that this person had said she was damned to hell and that she was a sinner, a bad person. And I asked her, I said, Grandma, or as we say in Jewish, Bubby, I said, how did this person get in here? How could they possibly be bothering you? This is a Jewish nursing home. And she explained to me that they were a member of the paid staff of the nursing home. That prompted me to investigate. And I found out that there was a particular group called Jewish Voice Broadcast, which is a group that targets Jews for conversion to fundamentalist Christianity, that had infiltrated the paid professional staff of the nursing home with the intent of proselytizing or recruiting. And I worked with the director of Kivel Nursing Home in the 80s, and we rooted out those people that were on the staff that were affiliated with this group. They were terminated. And then I found myself in the role of a community organizer, an activist. I served on a number of committees in Phoenix, Arizona, and then later in New York for the Union for Reform Judaism. And then I worked for a social service agency, and then I worked for an educational bureau also with the Jewish community. And so it really just kind of evolved from a personal experience to something that became unintentionally a career. My grandmother was never recruited. I mean, she was a devoutly committed Jew and had no intention of converting to another religion. The issue for me was the idea that, first of all, a group could covertly infiltrate a Jewish nursing home with an ulterior agenda. And second, that no one had requested for them to come and share their ideas or their faith. I had no problem, by the way, with them coming through the front door on request. For example, someone saying, well, Mrs. Goldstein would like to do a Bible study with someone from the ministry. I have no problem with that. It's the idea that they were surreptitiously and covertly infiltrating the paid staff of a Jewish nursing home with a hidden agenda that upset me. And quite frankly, it upset the larger religious community in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was able to, under the umbrella of the Jewish Federation of Greater Phoenix, put together a brochure called What in God's Name is Going On in Arizona, which was endorsed ecumenically by most of the major denominations of Arizona. And we came to a kind of consensus about what was ethical and reasonable in proselytizing, that you should not go where you are not wanted, that you should not be stalking people in nursing homes or hospitals unrequested, and that families deserved respect, that you should not try to proselytize a minor child without parental notification and consent. So we came to a kind of consensus about that, and that then drew me to national committee work and agency work for the Jewish community through the 80s. Today, my work is largely built on doing what has been called cult deprogramming, or I would call it cult intervention work. That is, families retain me to do an intervention, much like a drug or an alcohol intervention, with the family to get someone out of a destructive cult. That is a large part of my work. I also do expert testimony in court cases. I've done quite a bit of expert testimony over the years, beginning in the early 90s. And I lecture at the college and university level. I've lectured at more than 30 colleges and universities and testified as an expert in more than 10 states, including United States federal court. The Cult Education Institute is an online library that was first launched in 1996. It was originally called rickross.com, but when the rapper Rick Ross became much more well-known than the cult expert Rick Ross, I decided to change the domain name entry point to the culteducation.com site. It is a very large database today that has taken almost 20 years to build, and it includes thousands of articles divided into hundreds of subsections. There is a large message board where there are more than 120,000 entries from former cult members and affected families that is available to the public. There is a virtual library in association with Amazon.com where people can get books about destructive cults or about particular topics of interest related to cults. And there is a links page with additional resources made available. So the Cult Education Institute is a 501c3 educational nonprofit library that is online, available free to the public, and is a member of the American and New Jersey Library Associations. Families and individuals benefit from having the Cult Education Institute online because when we search for information about controversial groups and movements, some that have been called cults, it's convenient to have such a large database where you can go through information, search names, find the kind of background educational material you might need to make a choice as to whether or not to participate in a particular group or program. And I think having that resource there for individuals that might be considering involvement with a certain group or program, or for families who are affected by a loved one who has been recruited into a group or program that is controversial, is a very important resource. And people use the Cult Education Institute database for research every day. Thousands of people use that database. I recently completed a book, Cults Inside Out: How People Get In and Can Get Out. This is the English version of the book. It's 584 pages. There are 1,200 plus footnotes with research. There's an 18-page bibliography and a 15-page index to make it easy to find a topic in the book. The book has also been translated into Chinese, into complex Chinese, which is now available throughout mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So what the book includes is a compendium of information about destructive cults, beginning with the history of modern cults, which is very important because many people, when you say Jonestown or you say Aum Shinrikyo or whatever, some group from the 70s, the 80s, or 90s, they haven't heard of that group, young people, and they don't know what happened with that particular group, no matter how horrific the tragedy historically may have been. So what Cults Inside Out starts from the beginning to do is it chronicles the history of modern cults, beginning with Charles Manson, moving forward to today. And it breaks it down into large groups, smaller groups, family cults, and so on. The book also offers in one chapter a definition of a destructive cult, or if you will, a nucleus for a definition. And then there is a chapter on cult brainwashing that explains that synthesis of coercive persuasion and influence techniques that people in popular culture now call cult brainwashing or have called brainwashing. And then there is an explanation of how the intervention process works and an actual case vignettes so that people can see it in real time, how interventions are done in an array of groups with different beliefs, different philosophies, and so on. And finally, a chapter about recovery, how people put the pieces together after a destructive cult experience and move on with their lives. I think people can benefit from the book Cults Inside Out in many ways. First of all, families who are struggling with a situation involving a group that has been called a cult can benefit from the chapters on assessment, coping strategies, and intervention. And then they can weigh their options. I think individuals who have left a destructive cult can benefit from the chapters on defining a destructive cult and cult brainwashing, so that they can unravel their experience and contextualize it. Many people that have read the book have said, I benefited from hearing the voices of other people affected by the phenomenon. And I was able to see I was not alone, and that there are other people out there that have gone through what I have gone through and recovered. And I think people particularly benefit from the chapter on recovery, which includes the accounts of people that have recovered and how they've done it, so that it gives people leaving a destructive cult a sense of hope, that there is life after this experience and that I can recover and move on. Well, many people can be called an expert, but to be qualified and accepted in a court of law is a particular process. I've testified in about 20 proceedings in 10 states, including United States federal court, through what's called a Daubert hearing, where you're literally put on trial before a federal judge to determine whether or not you really are an expert before you're allowed to testify. I'm here to tell you that I testified in federal court after a Daubert hearing, and that at the end of that trial, my client was awarded $6.5 million in damages. So I've testified in civil lawsuits, in criminal trials. I was qualified to testify in the James Arthur Ray case. That was the so-called sweat lodge guru who was responsible for the deaths of 3 individuals in a so-called sweat lodge in Arizona, in Sedona. And many people were hospitalized as a result of exhaustion and dehydration. Ray was later convicted on negligent homicide. I worked for the prosecution on that case and helped to put Mr. Ray where I think he really belonged, behind bars. And I've also testified in a number of child custody cases, in particular, quite a few regarding Jehovah's Witnesses, where people are concerned about medical care of children. Jehovah's Witnesses do not allow for blood transfusions, so that can be an issue in a custody case. And for that matter, other cases where one parent is in a controversial group, or it could be called a cult, and the other parent is not. And the issue is, what is in the best interest of the child? To be with the parent who is in the controversial group, and perhaps that child might be hurt in that group, or to be with a parent who is not in the group and therefore be safer. And I've testified in a number of those proceedings. I have worked with law enforcement agencies over the years, including the FBI, the BATF, and local law enforcement. In particular, I worked with the BATF before the Waco Davidian standoff. I had deprogrammed 2 Waco Davidians, one before the standoff and one actually during the standoff, a person who had been literally locked out by the raid. I certainly had no idea that the BATF was going to do a raid, but they came to me for information about the Waco Davidians, specifically because I was the only cult expert at that time in the 90s that had firsthand information and had worked to do an intervention with a Waco Davidian. Later, I would work with the FBI because a hacker attacked the Cult Education Institute website, and I would eventually find out who that hacker was. I found out that he was also attacking the websites of Rolling Stone magazine, Carnegie Mellon University, and many others with denial of service attacks. He was trying to crash these websites because they had information that he didn't want the public to see. Eventually, through my work with the FBI, he was arrested, tried, and I testified against him in trial. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Well, I have worked with social services within the United States. For example, there was a terrible cult group in Ohio that 21 children were removed by Child Protective Services after children suffered horrific beatings and abuse in the group. I worked with all of those 21 children with a caseworker through their social services in Ohio. I've also worked with the Ministry for Social Services of the State of Israel in their development of a kind of paper on cults that has been widely disseminated in the State of Israel. And I've also lectured in China, in Thailand, and more than 30 universities, including the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Baylor, Carnegie Mellon, the University of Chicago, all by invitation because students at university campuses are frequently the targets of cult recruitment efforts. And those universities wanted their students educated in advance to immunize them, if you will, and prepare them for what could be cult recruitment activities. I have done a lot of work with the media over the years. I've participated in 14 documentaries. The most recent was recently shown in Toronto at a film festival about deprogramming, about the life of the first cult deprogrammer, Ted Patrick. I was interviewed as part of that documentary. I've worked as an analyst professionally for CBS News, CBC of Canada, Nippon Asahi of Japan, and I was a technical consultant to the actor Harvey Keitel when he played the role of a cult deprogrammer in the Disney Miramax film Holy Smoke, directed by Jane Campion. But over the years, I have just worked with virtually every news outlet, all the major networks, and also with networks in Europe, in Australia, in Asia, and also in the print media. So I've tried as hard as I can to bring that message of increased cult awareness to as many people as I could, using the media as a means for public education. There are many definitions for a destructive cult. I mean, I've seen so many over the 30-plus years that I've been doing my work. And I would say that they all seem to intersect on one set of characteristics, which were written about by the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton and published by Harvard University in 1981. Lifton wrote a paper called Cult Formation. And in that paper, I think he identified what I would call the nucleus for a definition of a destructive cult. Lifton laid out 3 simple characteristics or criterion. One is an absolute authoritarian leader who becomes the defining element and the driving force of a group, literally an object or focus of worship as the original beliefs of the group begin to drift and fade away. So you have this figure that determines what is right, what is wrong, and everyone in the group is in lockstep behind this leader who is that defining element. Second, Lifton said that you can identify a thought reform program in the group's process. That is, that the group is manipulating people to gain undue influence over them. And Lifton wrote a book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, and in the 22nd chapter of that book, which was published in 1961, he outlined 8 criteria to determine if a thought reform program is ongoing within a group or environment. Lifton studied POWs in the North Korean POW camps during the Korean conflict. And he was concerned with how the North Koreans were able to control and manipulate the minds of the POWs. And his research culminated in the book that he published in 1961, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Those criteria, which include control of information, control of the environment, the cult of confession, a sacred science, meaning unquestioning submission to the philosophy of the leader, that became the criteria to understand whether or not thought reform is evident in a particular group or organization. And so that would be number two, the existence of a thought reform program. Number three, if we are to think of the group as a destructive cult, the group would be doing something to harm people or exploit people. And this varies in groups by degree. For example, not all groups are going to stockpile weapons, have a compound, or sexually abuse members, or deny medical care, all of which does occur in some groups. But each group has its own degree of destructiveness, in my experience. So one group may exploit people simply on the basis of finances. Another leader of a group may exploit people sexually, may abuse children. So there are gradations of destructiveness from group to group, which vary by degree. But you look for those three primary characteristics. One, an absolute authoritarian leader that is the defining element and driving force of the group. Two, the existence of a thought reform program to break people down, to break down independent and critical thinking and gender dependency and gain undue influence. And then finally, number three, the culmination of one and two, is the ability to exploit and do harm to people, which is then evidenced either by financial exploitation, physical abuse, or some other form of harm. You take those three characteristics, and I don't care whether the group says we're religious, we're science, we're political, we're therapy, those three characteristics become the unifying nucleus to define a destructive cult, regardless of what the group says it believes. Finally, it's not what the group says it believes, it's how the group behaves that determines whether or not it is a destructive cult. Groups that have been called destructive cults can be religious. They can also be political. They can be a therapy, an exercise, a martial arts group. I've encountered groups that were based on running. Again, the three characteristics are what you look for. So the group may be religious, it may be a commercial enterprise with multi-level marketing, it may be a weekend large group awareness training, seminar, self-help guru thing. Whatever it is, you look beyond the facade and you look for these three primary characteristics that define a destructive cult, because groups can come in many incarnations with many facades. The International Cultic Studies Association, which was created, 1979, I think, has said that they have received complaints about more than 5,000 groups in the United States alone. Now, since the advent of the internet and the web, I learn about a new group almost every day. So there are groups that may include as few as 20 or 30 people to groups that include thousands of people. What we have learned is that there are groups called cults all around the world. Whether they're in China, the United States, Canada, Europe, this is a global phenomenon. In fact, today, I think we arguably are at war with a destructive cult, and I'm referring to the Islamic State, ISIS. This is a group that recruits on the web, that recruits through social media, and then siphons its new recruits into training camps that are not unlike cult compounds in Syria and Iraq. They use deceit, they trick people into romantic fantasies about marrying jihadists or whatever the bait is that they eventually switch to abuse, degradation, and violence. They have taken relatively normal people, educated people from the United States, from Canada, from Europe, and turned them into homicidal killers, willing to blow themselves up and murder people. I think that ISIS fits the criteria for a destructive cult. Number one, al-Baghdadi, their leader, who has declared himself a caliph and his territory a caliphate, fits the mode of an absolute totalitarian leader that is the defining element of ISIS. Number two, I think from the accounts of families, from the accounts of former members of ISIS coming out of ISIS, escaping Syria and Iraq, there is evidence that they were manipulated, that they went through a process of coercive persuasion, and that ISIS, in fact, uses a thought reform program to create killers. And number three, I don't think anyone can argue that ISIS is not destructive. The beheadings, the bombings, the destruction of historical archaeological artifacts in Iraq and now in Syria. I mean, this is the most horrific, destructive cult that we have ever faced, perhaps in modern history. And I think that when we disabuse ourselves from the notion that ISIS is somehow an expression of Islam or an expression of radical Islam, and we begin to see it more for what it really is, a unique, destructive cult that is an idiosyncratic creation of its founder, al-Baghdadi, in much the same way that al-Qaeda was a creation of Osama bin Laden. I think that al-Baghdadi and bin Laden have as much in common with most Muslims that live in the United States, Europe, and Canada as the notorious cult leader Jim Jones, who was responsible for 900 people being murdered in Jonestown in Guyana in 1978, had in common with Christianity. I mean, Jones said, "I am a Christian pastor." Al-Baghdadi and Osama bin Laden say they are, or were, the true Muslims. I would say that what they all share in common is they are destructive cult leaders. And if we are going to say that al-Baghdadi is an expression of the Islamic faith, we might as well say Jim Jones is somehow an expression of Christianity, which I don't think he was. And I don't think that this current aberration of Islam that has done this terrorism that we're now dealing with is concurrent with their beliefs either. I think many people will say, well, are we seeing more cults today than we saw, say, in the 70s or in the 80s? And I would start out by saying that many of the groups that we knew in the 70s and the 80s, for example, the Unification Church called the Moonies, which many people called a cult, or Scientology, which has been called a cult, or other groups like the Hare Krishnas, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, they're still with us. In fact, they're quite large. What we see is the proliferation of new groups and the entrenchment of old groups. So this is an ongoing situation. The cult business can be seen as a business. That is, it makes money for the people that run these groups called cults. And as long as there's money to be made, there will be destructive cult leaders to manipulate and exploit people to make more and more money. There are some groups, though, for example, Wicca, the Wiccans, or various other groups that may be eccentric and unusual but are not destructive cults. I think it is possible for a group to have an authoritarian leader and to have a certain mindset and yet not be destructive. For example, the architect Paulo Soleri created a philosophy called arcology and began to build a city in Arizona called Arco Sante. He was a kind of philosopher king, and he had a group of followers, people that believed in his philosophy, but he did not exploit them, he did not hurt them, and they did build quite a bit of buildings and architecture in the desert of Arizona. You could say that it was a kind of cult, but if it was, and Paulo Soleri is now gone, he's deceased, I think it was a benign one. So I think it is possible for people to gather around a leader and adopt a philosophy, but do no harm, and therefore be a benign cult per se. Many groups that have been called destructive cults will say that they have changed their ways. The International Society of Krishna Consciousness, which was sued by children that were sexually abused as children in that group, went through a bankruptcy, avoided closing as a group through that bankruptcy and said, we have changed, we're not the same. And I would argue that in order for a group to change, and Michael Langone, who is the director of the International Cultic Studies Association, pointed this out in a presentation at a conference in Canada a couple of years ago. He said that in many groups there is a kind of pathology that is ingrained in the group. In other words, the leader has influenced so many people in that group. He has influenced, or she has influenced, the thinking of so many people in the group that there is an ingrained mindset in the group. And until you root out all the old people that are infected with that mindset, the group has a kind of pathology. It can be a pathology of fear, of secrecy, and so on. So I'm very skeptical about groups that say they have changed. Historically in the United States, there are people that followed William Miller, who said the end of the world would occur in 1844. Subsequently, when it didn't happen, Miller was replaced by a leader, Ellen White, who became the leader of what is now known as the Seventh-day Adventists. This organization changed from a personality-driven group under William Miller to a mainstream religion in modern America. So it is possible for some groups to change. Another example would be Jehovah's Witnesses, which was created by Charles Taze Russell. He and his successor, a man by the name of Rutherford, frequently predicted the end of the world, which did not occur. The Witnesses also evolved, but not quite as much as Seventh-day Adventists. And today, they still have much of that baggage from Russell. They were once known as the Russellites. But power has devolved to about 7 people who run Jehovah's Witnesses. But year in and year out, people die because they are members of Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't get a blood transfusion. That is a belief of Jehovah's Witnesses that continues to cause needless deaths every year. And most notably, children who are denied a blood transfusion by their own parents. The courts have intervened in order to sustain the child's life to get a blood transfusion. So I think that groups can change and evolve. Some groups can completely move into the mainstream, while others not so much or not at all. People use the term brainwashing, and they really don't understand what that term means. That's a popular culture word that came out of the 50s from a journalist by the name of Hunter. But what it really means is it's a synthesis, if you will, of coercive persuasion and influence techniques that have been crystallized and focused like a laser on people within certain groups to break them down, change them, and then freeze them in a certain mindset. Now, this was first explored by a professor at MIT by the name of Edgar Schein, and he published works, a book about coercive persuasion in 1961. And Schein said, literally, there are 3 phases to coercive persuasion. Break them down by whatever means necessary, break them down, and then change them. And then after having changed them, freeze them. So he would call it unfreezing, changing, refreezing. Schein was then followed by Robert J. Lifton, who studied POWs held by the North Koreans during the Korean conflict. And he then wrote the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which was published in 1961. Lifton was a professor at Harvard Medical School and also the John Jay School of Law. So he basically, in the 22nd chapter of the book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, came up with 8 criteria to determine whether or not a thought reform program is ongoing. And these criteria are basically a snapshot of the engine that drives what we call brainwashing. And it's composed of milieu control, which is control of the environment, everything you see and experience. Then mystical manipulation. Things appear to happen spontaneously, but in fact they are really contrived, scripted, and not spontaneous. Then there is the demand for purity, which is the demand that a person divide their entire life into black and white, the pure and the impure. There are no shades of gray, no middle ground. And then the cult of confession, that is, that there is no area of a person's life that they are entitled to privacy, that the group has the right to demand confession about almost anything, even about things that may not really even be true. There is a kind of element of purging going on, where everything about a person's life is being examined and being confessed to the group. And then Lifton calls another of his criteria the sacred science, which is that what the group teaches is absolute, that it cannot be questioned, and that anyone who questions it is unholy, unscientific, absolutely wrong. So that this is an absolute belief, that the group's beliefs can never be questioned, can never be critically questioned in any way. Then there is the element of what Lifton calls loaded language, which means thought-terminating cliches that are used to sum things up in a way that stops critical thinking. For example, in Scientology, people who are not Scientologists are suspected of being suppressive persons or potential trouble sources, which means a person that might be connected to a suppressive person. So there are these cliches, these labels within a particular group that terminate critical thinking. I don't have to consider what you have to say because you're a suppressive person, you're an SP, or a PTS, a potential trouble source. And then there is the criteria doctrine over person. And that is basically everything around you must be cataloged according to the group. Your own feelings, your thoughts, your emotions must be cataloged according to the doctrine of the group. Whatever is consistent with the group is valid, whatever is inconsistent is invalid and must be purged. And then finally, the most devastating of Lifton's criteria is the dispensing of existence. And that is literally the right to exist. The person who leaves the group ceases to exist. If they come back, they can exist again. Family and friends that question the group, you can cut them off, dispense with their existence. So you take these 8 criteria, and it doesn't matter what the group says it's doing. If 6 of the 8 are ongoing and evident, it's enough to run a thought reform program. If you will, what Lifton is saying is that each one of these criteria is like a piece in a machine. One relies on the other. The cult of confession enables mystical manipulation, enables the dispensing of existence. The dispensing of existence cuts off an outside frame of reference and reinforces milieu control. So what you can see is how one of these criteria enables and reinforces another. Also important in understanding brainwashing is the role of information and communication. Flo Conway and Jim Siegelman wrote a book called Snapping, which was published in 1978. That book talks about what they call information disease. That is, that if a group can control everything that goes into the mind, everything you see, everything you experience, everything you hear, they can control the mind itself. And they call it information disease because people are stricken by the control of information. That is, the group can do harm to people through the control of information. Conway and Siegelman would later write a book called Holy Terror about extreme fundamentalist groups, and they would talk about emotional control or emotional manipulation, literally being able to manipulate the emotions of people. And then Margaret Singer, the psychologist who taught at UC Berkeley, who wrote the book Cults in Our Midst, would talk about behavior being controlled in various groups, how they would control behavior. And she would say basically that the group was ultimately creating a deployable agent or a pawn through their process. And she would say to me, because I knew Margaret Singer and we used to talk and compare notes. And at one point she said to me, Rick, brainwashing is really nothing more than a confidence game. And a cult leader is running a con. The difference between the average con game and a cult is that a typical con artist will get the money and leave town. A cult con artist will keep running the same con on the same people, victimizing them for the foreseeable future. And she said, and that is what cults are all about, is conning people or tricking people into being exploited and being taken advantage of. I think many people would like to believe that being involved in a cult is somehow a personal choice, but I would say that no cult that I know of comes to people in a very transparent way and says, look, this is who we are, this is what our real goals are. We've been called a cult, and our goal is to control your mind and to exploit you and take advantage of you. There is no group that is that candid, that transparent. So what happens to people is they are tricked. And what we need to reflect on is, aren't we all persuadable? I mean, there is advertising. There are celebrity endorsements to influence us to buy certain products. There are political PACs running endless ads on television. What is it that we don't get, that we don't understand, that persuasion techniques and influence techniques are being used every day by corporations, by political parties, and self-interested groups to get us to do something? Robert Cialdini, a professor of psychology at Arizona State University, wrote a book, Influence, in which he basically says that there are 6 basic principles to influence, such as authority, liking someone, you're more persuadable by someone you like. For example, celebrity endorsements, influencing people because we like someone, we'll buy the product. And so Cialdini went down these principles in an examination saying, look, they can be used for good or they can be used for bad. So given that the world is filled with advertising and filled with propaganda to persuade us, to influence us, what makes anyone think that we are not persuadable? And all cults do is simply intensify and focus those techniques on the same people continuously to, as Shine said, break them down, change them, and then refreeze them. People would like to believe that only weird or stupid or emotionally damaged people can be involved in a destructive cult. I have done 500 cult interventions. Included in that number were 5 medical doctors. One was an orthopedic surgeon, another was an anesthesiologist. I am here to tell you that the most sophisticated, educated people can be tricked by a destructive cult. I've worked with people from all races, all socioeconomic backgrounds, people from good families, people from troubled families. I mean, the idea that it's only them, it's somebody out there, but not me, that can be trapped by a destructive cult is a foolish notion. And if someone believes that, it sets you up to be tricked by a cult because you've already decided you can't be, you're completely safe. So when this group approaches you through a trusted friend, through a coworker, through someone you know, and that's the way people often are brought in to a destructive cult, through someone they know and trust. That's when you're going to say, well, I'm invincible, I'm invulnerable. And so then you will be ushered in with your notions of invincibility, and you can be easily victimized. Anyone can become involved in a destructive cult. If you think that somehow you're immune, that it can never happen to you, you've already set yourself up and you're ready to be tricked and conned by a destructive cult. None of us are invincible to these persuasion techniques. If there is one situation or characteristic that I see that is a common element regarding many people that have been recruited and tricked by destructive cults, it would be this, that at that particular point in their life, they were going through a difficult time. They were going through a divorce. They were unemployed. They were physically ill. Someone had died that they loved. They were at a vulnerable point in their life, and at that juncture, they had the bad luck that someone fairly persuasive, or more likely someone they knew and they trusted, came along and said, I have a group that can help you. I have a way to heal you, to make the hurt better. Come with me to this group. Come with me to the weekend seminar. Come with me and you will benefit from this. And the person who was asking them to join that person was a true believer. So it was a sincere effort on that person's part. Other than that, I would say that it could be anyone, and that there is no particular profile for the victims of destructive cults. There are what have been called one-on-one cults. That is, one person dominating another person using coercive persuasion, control of information, isolation, to dominate and exploit that individual. We've often called it an abusive, controlling relationship. That is, one partner dominating another, cutting that person off from old friends, family, and isolating them, and frequently abusing them physically, as well as psychologically and emotionally. It's been called battered women syndrome. There have been people like Tina Turner, the rock singer, and Nicole Brown Simpson, who was the wife of O.J. Simpson, who have stories of being battered, of being isolated, of being cut off and manipulated by a dominant partner who was their husband. So I think this phenomenon can be seen in a group, and it can also be seen in a one-on-one relationship. There are some basic warning signs that people should look for regarding a potentially unsafe group. First of all, is the group authoritarian? Is there a leader who has no meaningful accountability? Is there no tolerance for critical questions or inquiry? Is there a lack of financial transparency in the group? Do you know where the money goes? Does the group influence people to have unreasonable fears about the outside world, about leaving? Is there any legitimate reason to leave the group? Or are people who leave always wrong? And is there a repeated pattern of grievances about the group? Do they have a history of bad press? Are they controversial? Why are they controversial? I think if you drill down in most of these stories with these groups that are controversial, you will find the reason that they're controversial is that they have hurt people, and there is a similar pattern of grievances and complaints against them. And finally, is the leader always right? Can the leader ever be wrong? Or is everyone who disagrees with the leader automatically wrong? I mean, if you look for those common characteristics or warning signs, you can begin to determine whether a group is potentially unsafe or not. If someone has become involved in a destructive cult or a potentially unsafe group, you will notice changes in their behavior. They may become extremely obsessive about the group. You may feel that their individual personality is fading and they're almost becoming clone-like, saying the same things, acting the same way as other members in the group. They may respond to any questions you raise about the group as persecution, dismissing these questions, refusing to answer them, claiming that any criticism of the group is equal to persecution. You may notice that their conversation is rather stilted and that they're using the same kind of group verbiage, and that they have a growing dependency on the group to make value judgments for them, to tell them what to do, that their decision-making process has been largely short-circuited. And they may not seem very spontaneous. There may be a real loss of spontaneity, of a sense of humor, and they may become increasingly isolated and cut off from communicating with old friends and family, particularly if they have raised critical questions about the group. And so if you look at these warning signs about, if you look at these warning signs of personal behavior, you can begin to identify what might be someone submerging into what could be a destructive cult. The most important thing for families to remember, if you think that someone that you love is involved in a destructive cult, is to remain calm. Do not say scary things to your family member like, oh, you're in a cult. That group is a cult. I mean, using that word will very likely cut off all communication. So what a family investigating needs to know first is remain calm and be focused, do research, go through a process of assessment. You may be wrong. The group may not be a destructive cult. They may just be an unusual fringe group that you don't appreciate, but that is not destructive. And ultimately, what you need to develop, if the group is a destructive cult, is coping strategies. How to cope with that person who is in the group, what to say, what not to say, avoiding arguments, avoiding confrontation. And then you can begin to consider other options, which may be an intervention to try and get that person out of the group. I discuss all of these stages of assessment, coping strategies, and weighing options in the book Cults Inside Out. Anyone that is going through that process of assessing whether a loved one is involved in a destructive cult or not can go to the Cult Education Institute web database and see if there's any information. If there have been complaints posted through the message board, there are more than 120,000 entries there, or to see if there have been articles or research papers written about the group. The web, the internet, is an enormous resource for any family that is researching whether or not a loved one is in a destructive cult. And that is what I would urge families to do, is be careful and be deliberate, and go through a process of due diligence to determine whether or not the group truly is a destructive cult. A cult intervention is not like counseling or therapy. In counseling or therapy, the counselor or therapist is persuading an individual, and there are certain ethical considerations regarding disclosure and so on. So in counseling, you're really not doing what I would consider a cult intervention. A cult intervention, the way I do it, and the way I explain it in my book, Cults Inside Out, is an educational process. You're sharing information, you're educating the individual, first on how to define a destructive cult, second on how to understand thought reform or coercive persuasion techniques used by cults. Let me back that up. Second, there's a block on understanding what people call cult brainwashing. That is, how do cults manipulate people to gain undue influence? That entails talking about coercive persuasion and influence techniques, talking about thought reform, and really asking repeatedly the question, and this is what intervention really is about, is thought-provoking questions to stimulate critical thinking and analytical thought. And so what you're asking the individual is, does this resonate with you regarding your group experience? That is, as defining a cult is described, as thought reform is described, do these characteristics and techniques parallel your experience in the group? And then the third block of an intervention is devoted to what information could there be that you do not know about the group that you're involved in. What information has the group withheld from you deliberately? And sharing that information with the person that I'm doing the intervention with so that they can understand what's behind the door. What is the full history of the group? And in many cases, people had no idea what was going on in a particular group or with a particular leader. And then the fourth block of an intervention is, why is your family, your spouse, your adult children concerned about you? Because when I do an intervention, there are other people in the room, always. And that would be family, friends, a mentor. It's very much like a drug or an alcohol intervention where you're bringing together a group to intervene in what is seen as a crisis. That is the involvement of the individual with a destructive cult. So at one point in the intervention, the family will discuss, these are the reasons that we have brought this man to do an intervention with us. And these are our concerns. At that juncture, the family will discuss why they are concerned, what changes in behavior they've noticed, what events have taken place. For example, there may be medical neglect. There may be assets that have been surrendered to a certain group. There may be physical abuse. Whatever is going on, the family will then discuss it and say, this is why we are here. This is why we are concerned about you and why we asked to have this intervention. So you cover those four blocks during an intervention. Number one, defining a destructive cult. Number two, understanding how thought reform works. Number three, what is the hidden secrets of the group? What information is there that maybe that group member does not know? And finally, what concerns does the family have? An intervention will take 3 to 4 days. That means that we're talking about 8 hours a day for 3 consecutive days, 24 hours, or 4 days, 32 hours. I also will meet with the family the day before the intervention begins so that we can prepare for the intervention, which will follow immediately the next day. I've done 500 interventions since 1983, and less than a fraction of 1% of the people that I've worked with have later, after deciding to leave a group called a cult, then gone back. So the recidivism rate of deprogrammed cult members is very low. I will say that a number of people that I initially failed with later decided to leave the group, largely as a result of the information that was shared during the intervention.